Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that you were able to tune into this session, and I hope that you have been enjoying the conference so far this morning. I am Rachel Decker. I'm the president of Detroit Philanthropy. With over 20 years of experience, we specialize in providing nonprofit fundraising consulting to mid to size nonprofit organizations. So because of my work in this field, I recognize how COVID has greatly altered the fundraising landscape, forcing many nonprofits to rethink how they are engaging with their donors and eliciting their support. So I'm honored to be able to be here today to offer you some advice and hopefully help you overcome some of those challenges and chart a course for 2021. So with that in mind, there we go, today's agenda. I am going to spend about the next 25 to 30 minutes discussing donor messaging. We'll talk about donor engagement strategies, and then I'll share an action plan and a template at the end of the session so that you have really kind of a working framework that you can along the way during the presentation. I'm going to also try to incorporate some tips as to how you can keep the board engaged in this process, because as we know, engaging with your donors is really an all hands on deck experience, and they should be partners with you in this work. And then just finally at the end, we will have plenty of time to answer your questions. So with that, let's go ahead and there we go. Okay, we'll jump into messaging. So even though we are stuck at home, we know that it's vital that you continue to stay visible. And the first step in doing that is really to begin to refine your message. Donors certainly don't need to have the need explained to them in much detail. You know, at this point, everyone really understands the negative impacts of COVID and how that's likely affected your programming as well as your fundraising efforts. So instead, what's really critical is that you are able to effectively articulate how your organization has responded and why your mission is more relevant than ever. You know, how has your organization pivoted successfully during COVID? And what about the ongoing pandemic has made your services and your mission more relevant and needed than ever? So for instance, if you serve disadvantaged students in an after-school environment, you know, talk about how you've been able to effectively pivot those services over to a virtual model and why those services are needed more than ever to ensure that kids have access to educational and enrichment programs. You'll also want to share how you are succeeding. So the last 9 months have exposed many nonprofits' weaknesses. Those that weren't well managed to begin with are struggling to be able to pivot their services. And those that didn't have a strong fundraising program to begin with don't necessarily have the relationships to raise funds in the current environment. So it's critical that your messaging around the fact that you were able to overcome these challenges and that you are in fact succeeding in the new environment. You know, everyone really wants to be part of a winning team. Along those lines, it's also important that your messaging include success stories. So more important than just how your organization has overcome the challenges of COVID, it's critical that you talk about how your clients are succeeding in this environment. So talk about their personal stories of overcoming adversity and do it in a way that donors know that it's directly tied back to their support. How were they able to make an impact on your program? And lastly, you know, as a mentor used to always say, you don't get what you don't ask for. So it's important that you are communicating your needs and that you are as specific as possible. Now more than ever, it's important to tie your fundraising messages to exact outcomes. So instead of just saying, you know, we need your support, you're going to want to tie that back to an actual concrete goal. Physical needs like, you know, we need to purchase new tablets so that we can serve our clients virtually, or we need, you know, additional PPE on hand so that we can continue to see clients face to face, just, you know, depending on what your mission is and what your needs. I would also really encourage you to share an exact dollar goal to your campaign. So, you know, again, if you're buying new tablets for clients, be able to talk about, you know, we need $20,000 to purchase those tablets. Donors want to know how they are specifically moving the needle, and having those concrete goals is really effective in that process. So as we move into more specific donor engagement activities, I want to first just share some goals of donor engagement. So when donors and prospects interact with us, whether they know it or not, they are really looking to accomplish three things. They need to learn and understand your work and know that it's aligned with their own personal philosophies, and that they know that they can have an impact. They need to be able to like and to be able to trust you as the person who's asking for the money, as well as the organization and its leadership team. And they need to be engaged in meaningful ways, and that means more than just writing a check. So how else are they able to help you? So as we think about the donor engagement strategies that we're going to go through, it's just really important to kind of keep those overall goals in mind. So the first strategy that I'm going to touch on is really just get personal. I cannot stress this enough. I spend a lot of time working with my clients and stressing in other seminars like this that successful fundraising programs are relational. They are not transactional. And what's the difference there? Transactional relationship-based fundraising is a one-time shallow interaction. So it's the kind of fundraising that events are really built around. You know, organization X sells you a ticket, you buy the ticket, attend the event, you probably really never even interact with someone from the organization in a meaningful way. They certainly learn nothing about your interest in their mission or why you've chose to support and attend the event. And then they probably don't interact with you again until next year when it comes time to sell you another ticket to the gala. So you really continue this cycle of just this very shallow relationship. You know, you continue to buy your $100 ticket every year, but at the end of the day, that's not the kind of substantial impact the donor's hoping to make. And it's certainly, you know, not as financially beneficial to the organization that it could be if they had taken some time to get to know the donor. So conversely, relationship-based fundraising is built around a two-way relationship. And like all meaningful relationships, it involves multiple interactions over a prolonged time frame. So you really get to know your donors and have a deep understanding of why they're supporting the organization and what impact they are trying to make. So, you know, going back to our gala example, so you've come, you've bought the ticket, but then after the fact, the development director, you know, takes you out to have a cup of coffee and learns specifically why you're supporting the organization. You know, maybe it's a cancer organization and you find out that a family member has passed away from something, you know, a specific form of cancer. And then you're able to share with them, you know, more about how your organization is doing research in that specific field. Over time, you really have a lot of cultivation, you develop a strong relationship, you know, you learn that your donor wants to name something after the family member that passed away. You're able to put together a very detailed, specific, personalized proposal. You know, the donor funds it. At the end of the day, everyone really walks away from that experience feeling much differently than they did just showing up at a gala. And also, as that relationship builds, you know, the financial contributions of the donor get larger and larger. So, you know, this process really is certainly a lot more time intensive and strategic and focused, but if done properly, it bears much larger fruit than and results in a more sustainable fundraising program by rebuilding these relationships. So, you know, with the advent of COVID and everyone kind of being stuck at home, and us not being able to attend events and, you know, nonprofits not planning them, I'm really strongly suggesting that you use that time instead of, you know, picking out centerpieces and planning for seating charts, that you are instead really just picking up the phone and getting to know your donors and finding out why they support you. So the next engagement strategy beyond that is to amplify your social media. All the data tells us that in the last 6 to 9 months, Americans are spending far more time on social media than they ever have in the past. So use that to your advantage. Really develop a robust strategy with engaging social media content. Remember not to just feature your clients and programs, but also highlight your donors. That's a really great way for other donors scrolling through your Facebook page to really see themselves in that featured donor and to be able to think about other ways that they might be able to support your organization. Social media is also a really great way and should be a fairly easy way to get your board more involved in your fundraising. So be sure that they're sharing the messages that you're pushing out on social media. That really helps you increase your audience. And then I would also encourage your donors to share, a little bit about why they support your organization, why they sit on the board, why the cause is important to them. That can really go a long way in building brand reputation. So the next thing under engagement strategies there at the bottom is that, I suggest you think about developing new engagement strategies, or at least, if this is some work that you're already doing, that you consider increasing how much time you're spending in these areas. So, monthly giving, for instance, is a really great engagement strategy for smaller level donors. Monthly giving programs, are important to people who've maybe saw some own personal economic setback in the last few months. So, $1,000 all at once seems like a big sum of money for most people. But when you break it down to $83 a month for 12 months, that's a much smaller pill to swallow, if you will. But at the end of the day, your nonprofit still benefits from a $1,000 gift that year. So I really encourage people to think about developing formal monthly giving programs if you don't already have one. Create some associated donor benefits. Focus your efforts on really promoting that program. Annual appeals are set to go out any moment now. So I would, really make that a checkbox on your reply envelope that they can spread their gift out over those 12 months. Something else to think about is donor advised funds. Those are funds that donors have already set aside in, what I like to call a charitable checking account, if you will. So the funds are already out of, their hands. They're sitting there, they're waiting to be dispersed. So now is a great time to have conversations with people who give through donor advised funds about how they could potentially allocate a larger sum to you in 2021. And for those of you that don't know, you can identify those donors by folks that give through their financial institutions. So those checks would come directly from, a Morgan Stanley, a Merrill Lynch, the community foundation. Those sorts of organizations have those donor advised funds that people set up. So I would encourage you to spend some time there as you're thinking about 2021. Online campaigns are also something that we've seen have a lot of success in recent months, especially with the proper promotion and extended giving windows. Using lots of multidimensional content, so videos of your supporters, videos of clients. These are really great ways to get people engaged. And these online campaigns are something that we're finding that corporate donors are really drawn to, especially those donors that would have maybe normally sponsored an event. So instead of having their logo splashed all over the party and on event signage and things like that, now they're all over your Facebook page, which really, increases their exposure beyond just the event. And then just lastly, not to forget about matching gift programs. Those are always helpful to fill revenue gaps and should be promoted in all of your your solicitations. So onto some more strategies here. Another engagement strategy that you should be doing is, some things that we've already touched on the board a little bit, but you should really be leveraging their support. Fundraising is more important now than it's been, in recent memory, because organizations are seeing such financial setbacks. So this really needs to be constantly reinforced as you communicate with your board members. And I know lots of boards, lots of individual board members tend to really shy away from these activities, but fundraising is an inherent and vital role of all board members. And during this time, it requires all hands on deck. So I would engage them in things like thank you phone calls, helping out with solicitations, and I would certainly require that they are making introductions on your behalf to potential individual and corporate donors. And by tracking that, sharing that information at board meetings, I think that it really helps to hold our board members accountable and ensure that, they're not just making their own contributions, but that they are serving as ambassadors in the community and helping you to raise critical funds. In terms of events, I would use this time to rethink your overall event strategy. We really still don't know what's on the horizon for 2021 and our ability to gather in large groups. So, I would certainly not suggest putting a lot of time and effort in planning anything that's in person at this point. And in terms of thinking through virtual events, we saw some early success with these in March and April. It was a very novel idea, if you will. But I think, as we all know, some level of Zoom fatigue has set in, which is a strange thing to say as I sit here talking to you on Zoom. But, I think that at the end of the day, that moving your event to virtual really has to make a lot of sense. And I would argue that it needs to be because that event is filling a goal other than just revenue. With proper cultivation strategies in place and engagement techniques that I'm sharing today, events are not necessarily needed to fill funding gaps. If you've been cultivating donors properly, if you're using this time to go back to what I mentioned earlier by building, deep relationships with your donors and talking to them about, their goals as well as yours, you'll be in a position to fill in funding in far more creative and better ways that will result in more significant giving than just by, kind of continuing the cycle of events. So before you go down the virtual event path, I really suggest that you do some kind of survey of past attendees as to whether they would attend. And by that, I don't mean just, would they support? Because if they'd write you the $100 check, regardless of whether or not there's a party to go to, then just take the $100 check. Don't put the time and effort into planning a virtual event if you don't need to. But if you are, again, going to go down this path, make sure that you've got a strong value proposition, especially for your corporate donors. Your sponsorship packet is going to have to look a lot different as to the benefits and ROI for the corporation. And I would make sure that, again, you're not putting that together in a vacuum, that you're really talking to your corporate sponsors beforehand to find out, what recognition benefits would be important to them, why they would really want to show up for that versus just, supporting your organization. And at the end of the day, don't be afraid to walk away. If the event doesn't make sense, then don't spend the staff time and resources on putting it together. As I've suggested, there's other ways to fill in those funding gaps. And by devoting your time to those, you could bear a lot more fruit. So, and then just lastly, on engagement strategies here, the tendency in these times is always to tighten our belts and pull back on expenses. But donor engagement relies on human capital. And when funding is harder to come by, when you have to work more to get it, it's really important that you invest in the efforts as to how you're soliciting that support. So the very last thing that you want to do during these times is to cut your fundraising or marketing budgets. And in fact, I would argue strongly that this is a good time to reinvest and, certainly be as strategic as possible and make sure that you're using your limited resources wisely. But considering how paid media might be able to gain you greater exposure, how would hiring a PR or social media specialist to develop really robust content and strategies during this time, bring in new donors? And what would working with a professional fundraiser that's really dedicated to engaging your donors, how would that affect your program? I think that those are really things that you need to think through. And I just strongly suggest that you consider at least the possibility of investing in some of these strategies. So the next thing on the agenda here is, now that we've talked a little bit about messaging and you've got some engagement strategies to maybe add to your toolkit of the things that you're already using, think through an action plan. And if this is something that you've not done before, that your organization isn't accustomed to, I would really make sure that you've got it built into your plans for 2021. And an action plan should address these four components. So who will you reach? What are your defined constituencies? These are just a few of them, but volunteers, prospects, major donors, donors who give at smaller levels. I would add board members to this list. Also, just how are you, your mass audience, just folks you don't even really know, but those people that are, reading your Facebook page. These are all your varying constituencies. For some organizations, this could also include their clientele, the individuals that they're serving in some capacity. So, really spend some time in sitting down and thinking through who it is that you need to reach with your message. And then how will you reach them? So, what are all of your communication methods? Certainly phone, email, social media. If you have some kind of newsletter, whether it's print or electronic, annual reports will be coming online in the next few months. This is also, how you get your places where you get your board involved. It shouldn't just be your development director and CEO making calls and sending emails. It also should be your board members. So thinking about using them strategically. And then, you want to think about when will you reach out, right? So this should be a regular schedule of touch points. Going back to building those relationships, we have to have multiple interactions with our donors. So, this month, I'm going to make a phone call to all of our top 20 donors. Next month, they're going to get a newsletter that's going to have some different messaging. The month after that, our board chair is going to send some thank you notes out. So really, what are those very regular touch points? And they will vary by the relationship that the institution has with the donor, as well as the potential gift size, right? So, how you're communicating with your $20 donors is going to look and feel very different than how you're communicating with your $1,000 donors. And then lastly, the action plan should address, what it is that you're going to ask for. And again, be as specific as possible. And, just also not every touch point is going to be an ask, right? We know people don't want to feel like ATMs. So every time you talk to your donors, you shouldn't always be asking for money. Some of it just needs to be showing gratitude. Some of it just needs to be communicating out impact. But when you do have an ask, those need to be timed out as well. So when we think about those four components, this is a sample action plan. So you've got, here on the left, your audience. Again, who are you trying to reach? And, your list should be much longer than this. This is just a sample. And then what are the tasks? So what are the various ways you're going to reach out to them? And that goes back to both the communication messages as well as, a little bit about what you're going to maybe touch on, sort of the theme of the message. And then this template shows it broken down by week. This is also something that, I would say maybe if it's a very short windowed campaign or something that you're doing, then maybe use the weeks. But otherwise, this could certainly be broken out by month. So, if we think through to 2021, you would just have a January, February, March, and so on columns. And just to make sure that as you fill this out, you're going to also want to be sure to note who on your team is responsible for this. So, is it the CEO? Is it your development director, other fundraising staff? Is it a board member, going back to their participation? Is it a social media person who's responsible for the Facebook, those kinds of things. But, we know that these actions won't take place if nobody is held accountable and responsible for them. So make sure that you are making assignments. And then just one last note before I open it up for some questions. a few final remarks about, things to remember as you're engaging with your donors. A good solicitation balances the needs of your organization with the interests of the donor. So therefore, engagement is not a one-sided process. Communication has to be two ways. It's not just you pushing information to the donor and them hearing about all the great, wonderful things you're doing, as well as all of the needs that you have. But it's deeply that you need to engage with your donors to learn about why they are supporting you. So while you may have an overarching mission, there are generally multiple pillars under that with specific programs or specific services that you have for your clients. And it may be, one specific area that's really drawn that donor to you. So you want to be able to tailor your communications with them about that. And you can only learn that information if you're really getting to know them. Also to keep in mind, donors want to be part of the solution. So there's a lot of problems at the moment that have really been exacerbated by COVID. And, we know that donors want to be a part of helping to make our communities better and stronger. So, while you want to be positive and show your successes when you're demonstrating your need, again, it is important that you're communicating with them and that you're helping to let them see the solution that you are bringing and how they can play a role in that. And then just lastly, I want to mention, now is the time to accelerate your fundraising efforts. Don't put your foot on the brake in any way. I talked to many people, especially, early on in the pandemic, that were wary about reaching out, mindful that everyone was going through a lot of things at that point. It felt uncomfortable to them to be trying to track down their donors, picking up the phone. And what we heard was that donors were, in fact, wanting the information. They wanted to know how their favorite charity was thriving and surviving in this climate. So, just because face-to-face interaction is limited doesn't mean that you should have an excuse for not connecting with your donors. You may not be able to meet them for coffee, but as we've talked about, there's a lot of other ways that you can engage them at this point. Simply sending notes, leaving voicemails, even if you aren't able to connect, they all really appreciate that. And in order to keep the fundraising ball moving forward, you really need to spend some time on that. So with that, are there any questions? And I think I just need to read the chat, right? Okay, so in light of the fact that many organizations have had to reduce their staff, how do we prioritize this plan? So, again, I think this goes back to, what I mentioned about now being a time to, if you can't certainly invest extra funds, to really be mindful about the areas that you're pulling back on. You need to have capable fundraisers on your staff. It doesn't always have to be a dedicated person, but if the CEO or development or executive director can play this role, I think what you need to do is to be sure that this isn't falling by the wayside. So this is, the kind of stuff that I see a lot of organizations, unfortunately, they get caught up in the day-to-day work of serving their clients, of managing staff, of other things, and they forget, because they're not hearing from donors, that they need to reach out to donors. So, fundraising is a very proactive undertaking. So it's important to, as I just shared with that action plan, have a plan and make sure you're working the plan. I have clients where we talk about, make sure that you just block off 2 hours on your calendar, every Thursday morning, and that you sit down and you make calls to your donors during that time. That if you're doing other specific activities, that you've got benchmarks and milestones built in, that you don't just sort of wake up one day and realize, oh gosh, we fell $100,000 short, but that you are, kind of keeping on top of those efforts. And I really just, stress again that fundraising has to be prioritized. You know, people won't just send checks unannounced. It's not how this works. So you do have to make sure that you are engaging people proactively. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I am just going to wrap up then here. So I did just want to share my contact information is up on the screen in case you guys have questions or you're interested in learning more about our work. I would also encourage you to follow Detroit Philanthropy on LinkedIn. We share a lot of great fundraising resources there and information, you know, kind of national as well as related to the local community. You know, I have clients that have job postings, all that kind of stuff sort of goes up there. So it's a great resource. And then also we have 2 of our own webinars coming up in the next, well, the first one is actually this Thursday. So we're doing a 2-part series. The first on November 12th, which is focused on foundation giving, and the second on December 10th, which focuses on corporate giving. So, you know, all of these panelists are really going to be sharing information with our nonprofit audience about how they can be planning ahead and what's on the horizon for their giving in 2021. And these sessions are both, you know, free to attend. All you have to do is go to our website to register. Which, you know, was back on the other page, but it's just DetroitPhilanthropy.com. You'll find it under the resources and events tab. So feel free to join us for one or both of these sessions. I think that, you know, have found in some panels that we've done earlier this year that folks have really been appreciative of hearing directly from those that are, you know, funding their organization. So hopefully you can join us. So with that, I will go ahead and say goodbye. I hope that everyone has a great rest of your day and enjoys the final closing session. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.